Hi, Andrea Morissette-Grisini, founder and CEO of WetheP. Delighted to be bringing Sigrid Iversen here today to talk with us about her broad experiences as a citizen professional, so broad that it's hard to pinpoint her down to one specific ability or impact that she has in the community. We'll try to get to as many as we possibly can in the short hour that we've got. This is a leader who's done some amazing things. She's just a mom, just a teacher, just a volunteer, and I think when you hear her story, you're going to find out what just can really, really mean in powerful ways for the community. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Very exciting to have you here. I do have a little experience with Sigrid. This is completely unrelated, but we sort of refound each other through some of her work with WetheP. So we'll get to that later. But I want to start out and go back a little bit further and talk about where you sort of found this citizen profession in yourself.
You know, it wasn't till later. I think I started to have a realization in college, especially of some of the broader issues that were out there, whether it was hunger or local community issues. I think the biggest impact that I've had towards the community has been when I ran for office. And I ran for state representative in 2010, and it was an amazing experience. And I lost, clearly, but what I gained from it was the fact that there was a whole lot that I could do that wasn't included in politics. In fact, not being a part of politics, with all due respect, actually opened up the participation that I could have in community, because I wasn't bound by ideology or making a party happy or the things that are so polarized in the country right now. So I feel like that really had an impact. I also joined a church. River of Joy is the church. Steve Bonishow is the pastor, and he really opened up and mentored me in terms of being able to identify the needs of the community and then do something about it. With the resources that I had around me. So those two events, I think, are probably the most impactful.
So this is powerful. So you're doing this backwards, you realize. So you ran for office, and in running for office, you learned how little office holders can do. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah.
Not with due respect to the people that go through the hard work of being elected. But explain more about how little they, in your mind, with due respect to people that take that on.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I noticed is after I lost, I ran against Pat Garofalo, and after I lost to Pat, I went up to the Capitol to hopefully create some dialogue and have some conversation, especially about education. He was the chairman of the Education Committee at that point. I had some very big concerns about funding and the realization that so much of the funding comes from the state level. People think that the levies are where it comes from. In reality, that's not the case. And so I went to visit Pat, and although we have totally different philosophies and priorities, I suppose, he was so knowledgeable.
He's a good competitor.
Yeah, I mean, he's so knowledgeable, and he could talk about the ways that things work that are not textbook. I mean, I teach social studies, I have taught government, I know the textbook, but to actually be involved is a whole
so what are
part.
those? So when you're teaching your students now, how are you teaching them differently? I mean, you have to teach the textbook, I presume.
Yes.
And yet, how do you square those differences?
I think it's in the details. It's in the things that aren't clearly understood. It's in the power of special interest groups. And when I say that, I mean people with interests that are special, because special interest, I think, is a negative connotation oftentimes, but there are groups who have come together to try to represent their interests, and there's nothing wrong with that. They are powerful groups. And so I think that was somewhat amazing to me, because there was such an involvement. You know, it's so easy to say, well, the senators and the representatives, you know, they each pass a bill and they come together and they sign it or they veto it. But the whole relationship building and the back and forth with these groups is really quite amazing, and the networking that you need to do. I remember thinking, wow, as much as I differ from Pat, he really knows what he's doing. You know, I mean, and so, but he didn't have the freedom either. He's very bound by his party.
Right.
So that's, I think, where.
Well, and he's bound by with, you know, we are in a culture of information.
Yes.
And teachers and leaders and media companies like us love information. We generally have a real bias towards more information rather than less, right?
Yes.
But Pat, I had a chance to talk with him, and we talked about this issue. What I, at the time, was thinking of as solution saturation. So it was groups needing solutions, many of them really sincere and important needs that they had. But senators and all kinds of different politicians, policymakers, have to weed through volumes and volumes and volumes of information, some of it conflicting, some of it confusing, some of it parsed and perhaps that negative special interest, and some of it very, very sincere that's getting lost in piles and piles. So in a way, they're also obstructed by trying to navigate all that information, plus keep some sort of a party line.
Yeah.
And as now you're finding, so then you were liberated.
Absolutely.
Through your loss, you were liberated from disabused, might be another way of putting it. And I know you well enough that I could also see you maybe running again in the future. So I don't.
Anything's possible, right?
Anything's possible. So, but tell me about that liberation then. Then what did you do when you got the wings to really dig into citizen engagement?
Wow, you know what? I listened, and again, the people that were in my life just told me, you know, listen to what's out there. And what is very dear to me is education. As I said, I said, I'm a teacher. I feel so wholeheartedly in the investment of kids as being the future. Sounds kind of cheesy, but it is the reality of the matter. And so that is a passion that I have. One of the things that people don't realize that in the south suburbs, and I specifically come from Lakeville.
And this is Lakeville, Minnesota, which is a south suburb of Minneapolis and St. Paul in the Twin Cities of Minnesota.
Yes, there is struggles, there is poverty, there are children who are struggling to get to school.
And this is a wealthy,
this is a fairly affluent,
let's say, right?
And you would absolutely think
this is not an inner ring.
No, this is not an inner ring suburb even. In terms of poverty and challenges, I always say linguistic challenges, but to me that means cultural immigrants who are trying to you know, get that step up that they work so hard for and they come to this country for. You know, that exists. And I remember being at a party, I think it was a Halloween party in my second grader's classroom, and there were like 15 parents. And I was talking to a woman who was actually a teacher in another building, and she said, you know what? There are 20 parents in this building who want to help. In my school, we're lucky to get 3. And I thought, okay, that's where you see the inequity. It's not that these parents don't want to help; it's that they can't, and that's the difference. I think that.
And why can't you know? I want to talk a little bit since you're bringing this up, and when, as always and delightfully, we're going a little off script, but I want to dig into this. It reminds me of and we live somewhat nearby and in the same school district. In fact, I was at my children's school some years ago, and it was after hours, and the principal was talking to a parent who was having a hard time getting to, it was an English as second language parents class to allow them to help support their students. Well, the parent couldn't get to the school and was wanting to walk to the school, and it must have been winter, and the principal saying, do you realize how far you live away from? So it's not always the fact that the parent is not wanting to be there or doesn't understand that they have to be there, or even in this case, you know, overworked, and as many are, it was simply a logistic that just doesn't work. And what this principal taught me was it's often that simple, and frustratingly so.
Well, and there's some work that I'm doing that is an extension of a program with 360, what used to be 360 Communities, where they have set into place,
which is a social services community
the groups,
in this area.
The groups that are that represent leaders and the school district. They have created a formula or a template so that they have assisted these groups to come together. I believe there's one in Burnsville. I'm not sure what they've chosen, but in Lakeville, they chose early childhood education. So it's a very large group of individuals, and they started to pull in community members and people who were already doing things around the community, with really the primary goal of identifying what the concerns were, what are the barriers, and how can we bring different community members, whether they are a community bookshelf like my group, whether it is Rotary, whether it is business owners, to see what they can do. You don't want to rebuild the wheel. It doesn't make any sense. And so this particular group addresses, you talked about transportation. That's one of the things that our small group addressed. Parents in these neighborhoods don't have the ability to participate with their kids in many cases. And I've gotten to know a large amount of families in these neighborhoods, and I can honestly tell you, it is not for not wanting. It is logistically so difficult for them for lots of reasons. So that's a myth I wish we could dispel.
So let's talk about community bookshelf, because I bet you that's woven into these solutions in some fashion or form. So tell us about community bookshelf in this known as affluent suburb that has also the realities of having some poverty, having some differences in culture and transportation, whatever the issues are. So when did you start it? Why did you start it? How's it going?
Well, it started with a friend of mine. Well, I should back up. It started again back with Steve, who was a great mentor for me, who talked about let the things that are issues come to you, because they will come to you. And very much in a spiritual sense was his, his take on it. And it was for me as well. And so the story that I told you about all of the parents, that I think that was one of the beginning points.
So paying attention to that.
Yeah, and in allowing your mind to kind of simmer with some of this stuff.
Neat.
And so we were talking, a friend of mine who teaches in the district, Lene Anderson is her name, we were talking about, just on a friendship basis, wow, is there any way to get any tutoring programs started? Is there any way to make sure that the kids in these neighborhoods that are struggling can have some help? And she kind of fly by night said, yeah, there's lots of options. And we talked a little bit. And then she started talking about how she would come into these neighborhoods where kids didn't have access to books.
And I know that teachers will go into neighborhoods in the summer and on their own time, and I believe at least some, if not all of it, is volunteer.
It all is, yes.
And they will go into apartment buildings where there's a concentration of population of kids that could use some support.
Yep.
So I'm guessing that maybe that was her experience. She's actually got this experience, but she's realizing, okay, the teachers are ready and want to support, and the families are willing to have the support, and yet there's this missing link.
That's exactly what happened, because the community that we went into, the neighborhood was Queen Anne, which is a manufactured home community. And a lot of their kids came from that community, and she had worked with a lot of those kids. So she and her own children took books in and gave them ices, which really works, I'll be honest with you.
Absolutely. Straight sugar and books, what's not to like?
I know. We now bring fruit in. That's been an evolution, and that works as well too, actually, believe it or not. But so we were talking, and I said, wow, you know what? This really might work. Let's just put it out to our networks and see what happens.
So you're going, well, what? So what are you saying?
That taking books into these communities, because these kids didn't
have
access.
But not just you and Linnea, but
well, no, it started with just you Linnea. Yeah, I mean, it started, and I said, I'm just going to throw stuff out to my network, and she said, I'm going to do the same thing. So we set a date. We talked to the manager of this particular community, Queen Anne. Her name is Tanya. She was wonderfully supportive. We said, we just want to do this. We've heard that kids are not getting to the library. They need to, read. She said, fantastic. So we picked a date, chose a date, and kept communicating via email, and asked people to donate used books. That's an important part of this whole concept.
Used but well
gently
cared for.
Used and well cared for and loved books.
Loved, yes.
Because this is about sharing. This is not about, we are giving you something because you don't have it. I'm so sorry, but this is, I mean, it's the
kind of
we-they
reusing
concept.
Yeah, I love it, yes.
It's the idea that you share things when you have
Well, I remember
extra.
Donating some years ago and thinking, my kids, this solves a problem. It solves that problem in the bookcase of my home where we've got all of these, picture books, and my kids have moved on. And you know, it also solved the problem of mom holding a little too closely onto those books and
they bring
giving
memories,
them. And
don't
no,
they?
but no, to your point about sharing, I remember going, well, this is great because somebody else is going to love the books.
Exactly.
That was an impetus for me.
And you know what? That brings community in because they're giving the books. And so that is their step into community. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes,
so
absolutely.
there's all these different layers and different levels of participation that people are able to give. And I kid you not, 3 weeks in, so we probably put the email out the end of May. 3 weeks in, I had 1,100 books in my dining room, which provided lots of logistical difficulties in my house.
Pizza for dinner?
Yeah, exactly. but so awesome. Like, I was so blown away. And that just feeds you. Yeah, I mean, that when you see that, it's just, you just go, oh my gosh, this is so awesome. So what happened is it just took on a life of its own.
Okay, but I want to talk for a minute about this because this is what WetheP is about, is this feeding effect, this social contagion effect, when things, you kind of put yourself out there and then you're kind of blown away at the reaction, at the positive reactions.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of negative reactions out there, but when that positive thing goes on, you just go, there's hope.
Yeah,
you know, there's hope in humanity.
Absolutely.
I have hope, and they're giving me hope, I bet you, when you were
Yes.
seeing these books. But I also know that it's, or what you're an organizer, and being an organizer is a special skill. I think that you did some things a little differently than others might have done. I mean, do you ever reflect on what you did that might have helped that be as successful?
I mean, I think I had the ability, or I have the ability to communicate well with people. So it was not a scary thing for me to go into these neighborhoods and not know anyone. Oftentimes, the first couple years when we would come into these neighborhoods and there were maybe 15 kids and I knew there were 15 more out there, we would just walk around the neighborhood, knock on doors, you know, wherever there's kids
some
stuff.
would say,
knock on the
are
door.
you crazy?
Yeah, oh yeah, well, I'm aware of that.
And how did you handle that?
Didn't really, I don't know. I didn't really, I didn't think
didn't
about it. It
register.
just didn't
Okay.
even register. I
Good,
thought,
good,
well,
good, yeah.
okay, you know, perhaps I am, but this is what I do. So, yeah, it didn't register at all with me. So, so I think that's important to have kind of no fear. I don't have a whole lot of fear about stuff like that. Plus, I am continually amazed at when you ask, you get things a lot. When you ask for things, you get them. It's that barrier of not wanting to ask, you know. So
Talk
that was
about
a part
that.
of it.
This not wanting, that is endemic. In Minnesota, we are Norwegian and Spanish. We do have a
Some of us,
wonderful
yes, we have a
Hispanic,
good Spanish
and they, like
population.
us Italians, have got great energies. And
Absolutely.
forgive me to my Norwegian and Swedish friends, but we're in that Midwest nice, and it is. I do hear this a lot. It's hard for me to ask. I don't want to assume. I don't want to offend. I don't want people to feel put upon. So how did you overcome that piece?
The more I asked, the more I
The
more I received. It was just a domino effect. And I found that people had admiration for that. And that just helped to motivate me, for me asking, you know, and this idea that I could ask. And
because they're sitting back going, I wish I was. Is that kind
I
of part of
probably,
it? You think?
which, you know,
so you're leading by modeling, not knowing you were.
Yeah, I just, like I said, I'm very amazed at how people respond. And being able to come in and compromise, well, if we can't do this, is there a way to do it this way?
So not saying this can't be done.
Exactly, exactly.
We've never done this before. We don't do it this way.
Yeah.
How did you handle those, or how did others handle those?
There was, people accepted it. They were very, I mean,
You just said,
the
we've got to figure
positive
it out.
response, that we received back it was almost like a light bulb. It was, oh my gosh, okay, this definitely works. I think and I don't know if this fits in where we're at, but I think it's really important to understand as well that in this process, it started out about books and literacy and concerned that these kids were not getting what they needed over the summer, to relationships. And so when we talk about personal stories and we talk about what those families are going through, these are my neighbors.
What have you learned?
These are my neighbors.
So here's something. This couldn't be more appropriate for the discussion. And WetheP's challenge is that we are although we work very closely with in community groups, and we love in community groups that are meeting in community. We don't want everyone just behind a computer. And yet we also realize that the mountain is here, and it's called the internet. And so we bring the mountain to the Muhammads
Absolutely.
or the Bills and Janes and Joes and all of us. So we need to use this as a great tool, just as you use books as a great tool. But the relational piece, change doesn't happen without relationships.
No, it doesn't.
So talk more about that.
It doesn't change because when you provide a service, so when we would bring books in as a service, and I didn't ever approach it like that, but
Right.
because that's not how it ever felt for me. It never felt like we and they. It felt like, oh my gosh, there's kids out there that don't have books. Well, hello.
But you have an
I'm in a
advantage of
neighborhood.
being a teacher and perhaps having more exposure to kids that are
Absolutely.
different and families that are different. So what you're speaking to is you didn't, but you do understand that others were kind of going, this, we should just give them, if we're going to
Absolutely.
give at the church
Yeah.
or give money or, you know, feed them. But you're saying, no, it's got to be something different than
It
you know,
does.
a
It
hand
does.
down. It's got to be.
Yes, it does. And it was that for me right away, like I said, because it was about kids. And it grew out of a concern that I believed that Lakeville wasn't doing what they needed to do for kids.
And so what? So these kids don't succeed. If your kids succeed, isn't that enough?
You'd think,
If
right?
if
Absolutely
your
not.
students
No.
get A's in your class, that's not okay. That's not.
I mean,
why not?
it's great, but you know, I think there's a picture on Facebook out there that says, how do we know this child is not going to be able to cure cancer? There's just so much potential there. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad my kids do well in school. Got the gamut with my 4 kids, but it's not about just my kids. It's about a larger community, because if I get really philosophical, that is what democracy is about. That is where it is. I mean, education is so key to the whole process. What do you see in third world countries? Their lack of education. You talk about Afghanistan and the women there, or Malala, and you look at those resources that aren't being tapped into.
Student is the Afghani student who was stoned for wanting education for girls in Afghanistan.
So it's and we're global now. So it's not just about my kid in my neighborhood. It is about Lakeville as a whole. And I think in that vein, people were so surprised to find out that there was hunger, that there was the language barrier was truly a barrier. People don't have an appreciation, I don't think, in Lakeville. And again, with all due respect to Lakevillians,
right. It's not about.
It's not something that's really recognized. And so that is I think really important, is that there's some recognition for that. So it's got to be
it's a hidden reality is what I'm hearing you say.
It absolutely is.
It's not that people maybe even don't want. There's certainly communities that we don't want to see it. We want them on the other side of the tracks, or whatever the case may be. What I think I'm hearing you say is it just wasn't understood. You know, if nobody says, then we sort of think all things bumping along just fine.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
So speaking of no fear and foolishness, you teach high schoolers, and you don't teach in Lakeville, by the way.
No.
Which is that I want to make a point that you volunteer in the community that you live in, but you teach in a different community. So you're not saying I'm only going to volunteer where it's going to improve the scores in my classes. So high schoolers?
Yes, high schoolers.
And how you doing with that?
Oh, I love it. I love it. There's so much potential there. It's unbelievable.
Well, I'm laughing tongue in cheek, because you and I have worked together in your high school, and I was blown away by how impressive these kids were.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But I like to, I think a lot of us think of young people as maybe even the problem.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm not sure that has been my experience, and I know you have far more experience.
No, it hasn't been my experience at all. There's a lot of untapped potential there, and there's a lot of thoughts that I have. I don't feel as an educator I get enough time to deal with all of that untapped potential. We in U.S. history have a scope of history over an entire school year that is crazy. So to really dig in and to tap into some of those skills that provide community leaders of the future, that's something that we don't always get to do. And that's a struggle that I have.
Because you're needing to make sure that they understand the basics about, about history, those key pivot points and those, the world wars and the citizen rights
but
and
to
civil rights.
connect those things, that's the missing piece.
To connect them in application in a child's life.
And to understand why things are relevant. I think there's not a history teacher in the last 50 years that has not struggled with that. So it's not unique to now. And certainly the idea of kids being the problem, I struggle with that because we as adults set the world up for these kids.
And we're the ones that are arguing on Facebook about politics and about children and about education. So you, I don't know how you ended up organizing a few cats, and I was one of them, to do an event at your high school that you teach at. And when you talk about, you know, it's hard to apply what you're teaching, and yet this was an application. And it was quite from where I sat, I was just sort of in awe at how you organize this. So you use, as just a teacher, you use your organizational skills to organize all kinds of different people to advocate for a 2-day program at your high school to talk about a piece of my mind. You built it around some arts, 2 artists, one a photographer and one a musician, and then also my work as a civic engagement person. So where did that come from? Maybe I could recall, but you share that story. How did you?
Well, I have known Heather Lynn, who is
a performing,
a performing, you know, artist, poet, and who does amazing work. And it's so much about community and bringing in community and movements together and peace and all of those wonderful values that I think get lost in the crazy world we live in. And she has a calling for that. And then I met John Noltner through Heather Lynn. She was working with him. He created a book called A Piece of My Mind, which is
display.
A display, yes, which is wonderful. The concept was, what does the average person, and when I say average, maybe it's not even average, but different people with different experiences, how do they feel about peace? Yes, absolutely. And had this wonderful wide gamut, a gentleman who was homeless, a nun from, I think, St. Kate's.
Well, the sisters.
There were 4 of them.
There's 4 sisters.
There's 4 of them, and just this
McDonald's sisters.
Yes,
I have to give them a plug because they're sort of icons.
They are,
and you don't want to. I mean, they're also powerhouses. So I always want to be nice to the nuns.
Yes, absolutely. And they are powerhouses.
They're powerhouses.
It's cool. It's very cool. But my biggest thing is, I thought, how can this? I remember sitting at the opening of his book, and Heather Lynn was playing, and that's what drew me there. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, there's got to be a way we can bring this in to schools, because this is such a base value that if we introduce these kids to this concept of peace,
but you're talking peace in upper middle class.
The idea
conservative
of a global,
communities.
Yes.
This is where your high school, where you teach at, is again. It's somewhat like Lakeville, upper middle class, a leader in the state and education and in perhaps perceived wealth, if not real wealth. And so you're going to bring peace. I mean, which sometimes.
Well, and you know what goes with it? It's the globalness, if that's a word, of the world that these kids live in. So yes, they live in Eagan, Minnesota, or Lakeville, in this case, Eagan. But they have so many ways to connect globally, and the reality of their world is that is what it is about for them. And so to set that value and say, this is what we need to try to accomplish, even if they just heard it for that 45 minutes that we worked with them, that would help.
And John's work, to give credit to John Noltner, is an amazing photographer. And what his work is, and Sigrid touched on this, but I want to give it a little bit more focus because I think it's powerful. It's a me-to-we type work that takes, he's interviewed all these different people, CEOs of large international companies, and homeless people, artists, people of all different faiths, atheists, non-faith, every different type of person you could possibly imagine. And he has put them together in a book, all of them talking in their own voice about how to make what they see as a piece of their mind, how they see peace as possible in a sense in the world. And so it's a powerful piece that reflects a reality, I'm guessing, that these students see. So some of them are children of CEOs, and some of them may be children in poverty, and some of them are this color, and some of them are that color, and right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Some are artists, some are, you know, financiers. It's all different.
And the scope of peace isn't just peace in the Middle East, albeit very important, but it's also, individuals kind of talk about the idea of peace within themselves. And I remember one woman said, if you can't be peaceful here, you can't be peaceful out here. And so it addressed it in so many different ways. And the way that we started that program, I'm sure you remember, was with four of the subjects, four of the people who that were in this book, they came and read their story.
Explain the program, though. Explain the sort of, if you could just quickly explain the sort of the agenda for the 2 days program.
Well, we did a staff in service the day before. We had a staff day the day before, and then we took sophomores specifically into a program that would expose them to this artistry along with this broader concept of peace. Egan High School is amazing in terms of not only allowing people to bring their creativity like this, but also into these bigger community concepts.
I mean, for a principal to accommodate a 2-day event with in one case for sophomores all day long, and she also was willing to take seniors out of classrooms for partial day, if I recall, or maybe even more.
Probably partial day, but absolutely.
I know they were doing volunteering and so forth.
Yeah, they did a wonderful job
and
with
took our entire faculty out of the classroom during the school year. For a day.
I mean, it was amazing. But that is the philosophy of Dr. Zach and Dr. Rakowski, who head up Egan High School.
Principal.
Yeah, and they are, again, about community and about a bigger picture and about bringing these kids to different places.
What happened? I have vivid memories of the very last Heather Lynn singing, and then I had an opportunity to interview some of the kids. We did a little exercise that took what they'd learned and what they'd witnessed and all those feelings that were and reflections, and allowed them to kind of synthesize them with different others. All in this huge lunchroom at their round tables. And I remember a couple of people said to me, this is not going to work, and it worked.
Yeah, it did work.
And we brought,
absolutely.
And I think we invited kids up to stage and asked them to share their experience. And there was, I think all of us were a little anxious, how's that going to work out? And the list, or the line kept on getting longer. These were sophomores, sort of at the height of high school insecurity, with due respect to these great sophomores. None of us were on our strongest game when we were sophomores. I mean, you know, takes a little chutzpah to want to stand up in front of all of your peers as a high schooler. And I want to, you know, I was blown away. In fact, it gives me chills to even remember it. I remember one of the first couples, and they would come up in couples. They were asked to do some work with somebody very different as they could find in the classroom or in their group. And so one of the groups was a young woman, a student, sophomore, and what I would imagine was one of the big jocks. And she was perhaps more of a studious, more of an introverted child, and to hear him talk about how impressed he was, and to hear, I think one of them said, I don't think I ever would have talked to this person before.
That was part of it.
And I'm so glad I did. It blew us away, and there were many stories like that.
There were, and that was an important part of it too, was to connect kids that would have never connected through this common value. Because ultimately, when there was
their common value. It was built around this, you know, the piece that the talks by the people that John had covered in his book, Heather Lynn's music, and it was very layered in terms of really touching in some emotional ways students at a quieter level than you usually get in school. And then they were asked to work together on a shared value, to find their own shared value in their partnerships. So you might have a partnership that their shared value was family. We didn't tell them.
No, that was
they chose their shared value
organically. Absolutely. Because these kids have an amazing sense of who they are, and I mean, in years that are very tumultuous, right? I mean, like you said, though, you're not on your best game when you're 16 necessarily, but just this idea of being able to have these conversations and these thoughts was very cool. And I remember talking all of us about wanting to tap into that, making sure that kids were given credit, I suppose, for lack of a better word, because again, you know. We don't give kids credit necessarily. So
I observed, and you always observe, this is perfectly fine, there's fears, will this work, and so forth. And so I remember hearing, and we also looked at that. And the teachers that were involved, they had some skepticism, some of them did. And tell me what your take is of that, and maybe even the outcomes after. I mean, we those of us that came in left, you know, but I'd love to hear what you heard after, or what your observations are of the teachers or even the school since that event.
The teachers were skeptical probably, but I think what happens with teachers so often is that when you bring a program like this in, and then you workshop them, for lack of a better
when they
better
have so much,
concept.
they've got a lot of work on their plate already.
That becomes not the event itself, but the time is frustrating,
Right,
because the
right.
reality is
Understandable.
that we don't get a lot of time. Everybody knows that about teachers. So it's not necessarily that teachers were like, oh, it's the timing factor. It's the inability to do something that's a little bit out of the box, because we're being pulled in so many directions. So that's really, I mean, if there was any discontent, that's
and I think that's
what
such
I had
a
heard
typical
too.
frustration.
Oh, absolutely.
For sure, for teachers, probably more so than most people.
Yes.
But you know what I'm sure you've heard, we certainly hear is busyness, is
Oh,
having
yeah.
so much, and it's a different world right now. We are busier.
Yes.
So, but somehow or another, your principal, you, and the teachers, in fact, themselves were able to find it somehow, the time, and make it useful. And
Yes.
you're saying it was not easy. It's not easy.
No.
But was it worthwhile?
Absolutely, it was worthwhile.
Okay.
Absolutely. Egan is a very arts-oriented school, and so it was
Contrary to popular belief, because it's also great in athletics.
absolutely, and I'm
but
glad you said
they're
that.
wanting to
because
balance
There's just
is
talent,
what I'm
talent
hearing you say,
everywhere.
yes.
But yeah, I mean, they're very supportive. It's probably a better way to put it. Very supportive.
Wonderful.
And that was exactly, it fit so nicely. And so there was a lot of positive reception as far as that was concerned. And the idea that these kids are exposed to things, because I think that's a point of pride at Egan, that we expose them to lots of different things. Dr. Rakowski and Dr. Zach have worked very hard at creating a very open culture that makes a big school a small school. I think that Dr. Zach would tell you that, and this is part of it, these common values and bringing kids together and taking time to allow a class, this 500 kids.
500 kids.
Yeah, I think it's close to that.
But it's a big,
But
it's a good size class, is the point. This is not...
to allow them to come together with certain things, and they do that with each class. So I think that was received very, very well.
So let's go back a little bit and talk about students. You said, you know, you think there's great potential, and as a teacher you don't always have the chance to tap in, because you've got to be sure that they've got at least the baseline information. So talk more about this generation of students, if you would. What are you seeing, and what gives you hope? What gives you concerns? What are they saying?
Let's see. Let's talk about concerns first, because I like to end on the positive when it comes to kids.
Well done.
I have concerns, and I think the broader population of adults do as well, that students are not always given the opportunity to advocate for themselves. They are not patient. They expect short information in short, vibrant pictures, I suppose. Like I think of the media that I use video from thehistory.com, for example, and they're in 2 to 5 minute segments, and it's about perfect, which is okay, because it does help to create a balance, right? And it's very efficient in terms of these kids learning. You know, if you show much longer, they
well,
they
and it's typical
out.
of us as adults too. I'm just going to.
No, it's
I'm going to have their back on that one, because we're no different as
adults. You know what's interesting is, just as a side note, we have 46-minute periods, I think, and I always, about 20 minutes in, give my kids just a break, just to get up and move. And I've got a little basketball hoop in my room, and the kids, you know, I mean, just because I too, I'm like, after 20 minutes, you kind of go,
I need to get up and move.
Oh, I need to move. So I always give them that, and I think that's worked very, very well. But so the digital age concerns me a bit. I have concerns, as many people do, with messages that kids are getting, young women are getting, but even boys, you know, the boys that are getting messages about how they respond to women. I mean, this is a bigger issue,
confusing.
you know. And so there are those issues.
Well, talk, if you don't mind my interrupting a little bit here, because I know you've mentioned this as well. Talk about that. Talk about some of the gender concerns that you have. And I would just agree. I would just support that. I agree. I think there's some real serious issues going on with young women, real dissonance. And I think there's also some really serious issues, and they're somewhat related. In fact, I'll just start this out by saying you were reflecting before we started taping on young women, and what you were saying was exactly what I'm hearing from some young men, that young women often have this, it's bravado, I think, in a sense, and it's, as women, we're glad to see that that strength, and yet it's coming off as almost competitive, or almost pushing boundaries in ways that maybe aren't productive for them, or even their relationships with boys. And I'm so hesitant. You can tell I'm hesitating to say that because it's so tricky.
It's very tricky, and it's very covert. I mean, I think even as women who are pretty conscious of it, we don't even necessarily see it. I think that young women have the message that if they are overtly sexual, that's a freedom. That
sex is power.
That sex is power, but that as being female, you're not ashamed of your body, so you're going to put it out there. That's the way to do it.
Okay, and what's wrong with doing it that way?
Because it focuses on clearly the wrong thing, but it changes the scope of how we look at sexuality. It takes the focus away from young women becoming strong, bright, participatory members of society with who they are as opposed to what they have. And how many girls, how many times do we hear this, how many girls are a size 2? Kim Kardashian on People magazine, look at her bikini body. I mean, that's what these kids are seeing. This is on Huffington Post or on CNN.com sometimes, you know,
it's not just on People magazine is what you're saying. It's pervading.
It's more. I mean, in fairness, it's more.
But it is part of the culture.
But it's part of the culture, and we see that for young women as being strength because they're not ashamed of their bodies. Okay, well, that's, I don't feel like it's a piece of it.
So where's I mean, this is what we're struggling with, right? Because you go, well, maybe that's fine, and yet what isn't fine? What's that piece of it that's not so good? I mean, what are the repercussions? I'll just say that research shows that sexual abuse is actually going up rather than down. Now, this seems insane to me, given, you know.
What limits people more? Something that you can't change. So if I am expected to be a size 2 woman, but I am a size 12,
which is the average.
It's a hard thing to change. Or if you are size 2, but you have bigger hips, which is not as acceptable as being a straight line at this point. You can't change your bone structure. You know, there are things you can change about it, but think about plastic surgery and women who are just, and again, with due respect to people who make that choice, they absolutely have the right to make that choice, but what I struggle with is when it's an expectation.
Right.
And so it's oppressive to me that you put out there for women this
what
standard.
does it oppress? What does it oppress? Oppressive is an important word for women. I would also say for men, but we're talking about women today, and I'd love to talk with all kinds of people about boys because I'm equally as concerned with boys. But today we're talking about girls, and you have 2 daughters. I have a daughter, so this is relevant to us as well. But what is oppression? What is oppressive about that? What is being oppressed? Do you follow me?
Yeah, I do. I think it's plain and simply because that is where the focus is. I mean,
so is it oppressing brains?
It is. It's oppressing, and it's oppressing potential.
Potential. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you can still look at a powerful woman like Hillary Clinton, and she is continually assessed because of whatever size she is, what she's wearing, and if she makes strong statements, she is heavily criticized, called names, and so we think, and I think women have made a lot of strides. For sure, but we still have that out there, and so when you focus so much on sexuality, it's limiting.
So do you think that the focus, in the 60s sexuality, it was about everyone, free love, free, loving bodies, but it's somehow been sort of, there's something been corrupted through it, and by corruption I mean warped in a way. Through, am I getting, and without trying to be a prudish, which I'm not, but what's that about? Do you have any sense?
I don't know. I do think it's without, and I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but I absolutely believe that it is about keeping women in a certain position and not allowing for them to be in leadership roles. And to say not allowed, that's a little dramatic, but definitely making it more difficult. I mean, women still make, I think it's 80 cents to $1 that a man makes. So we believe that those strides have been made, but they haven't necessarily been made.
I want to address that, and we're going to have a good, productive debate, which I know that you and I can wonderfully have, because I'm going to challenge us as women on that one. But first, before I get to that, and I do want to get to that, but before I get to that, what is the impact on girls? that you see in your high school? Or your own
I think
children?
the impact on girls is everything from limiting themselves because the belief is that it's so much about outward appearance. I think that it is
hiding their intelligence.
Yes, perhaps hiding their intelligence.
Depression.
And there are certainly young women who don't do that. I'm not talking.
So there's
about,
your progress. You're saying there is good progress.
Oh,
yes.
absolutely. I'm not talking in absolutes. I just it's that percentage of girls that struggle that I worry about. Eating disorders, which is not a new issue. The idea that if you're going to literally make yourself sick and you're willing to potentially threaten your life to meet these standards. I mean, that's just so twisted. It's so twisted. And girls don't choose that for themselves. Those are the messages that are given. I think it places women in a position that they can't get out of, and then I think they move on to that. Okay, so here's my example. Here's my example. Okay?
Go for it.
We're going to go with Miley on this one. Okay.
We're going to go with Miley.
We're going to go with Miley because
good.
Miley has been ostracized. This is how I look at it. So Miley dresses in this very provocative outfit,
right,
making very sexual gestures. Robin Thicke is in this funky looking suit, but he is fully clothed. They do this twerking thing. Okay,
so he's also expressing a sexual.
He is,
right?
Well, yeah, but he doesn't have to be naked to do it on stage, right? And so this controversy happens, and who was ostracized for that?
Right. It wasn't
Robin Thicke
for being. Okay.
Do you know what I'm saying?
I'm totally with you. I totally agree with you. So, moving forward, how do we, as women, how do we, you talk about potentials, and I hear you, and I'm not going to at all argue your points. What I want to look at is how do we push and continue to express those rights that have already been earned. So what we know is that it is okay now for girls to play sports. It is okay for girls now to be intelligent, and you're seeing evidence of that,
Absolutely.
of them allowing themselves to be intelligent.
And I want to be very clear about that. That is so out there.
How do we promote more of that? Because I'm not sure that we're going to get around the Miley Cyrus or the Kim Kardashian effect. I don't think we have yet. I believe culture drives culture. So yes, ads and marketing and money and so forth do, and yet so do people. So if women are able to sort of block that out and continue to push and not be not allow themselves to be oppressed, and it does take more work, I think, and we can complain about that, and yet complaining isn't getting us anywhere, in my view.
And philosophizing is not getting.
Right.
Yeah.
So what do you think of that? I mean, how can we? I think of Lean In, Sheryl Sandberg.
Yep.
Really like her stuff, and I didn't at first. I thought, oh boy, here we go again. Yep. It's going to be another sort of, tap on the head, girls, yeah, rah, 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 or bad guys, or whatever it is. Yep. Me personally, not interested. She's not saying bad guys. She's not tapping. She's not saying rah, rah. She's saying lean in. Don't, one simple thing she advocates for is if you see a young girl or a little girl who is bossy, let her be bossy. Say that she's a CEO. I have one of my colleagues has a daughter that was strong-willed, not so much strong-willed, but just a clear leader. And of course, that's a harder child sometimes to parent. And I used to say, she's a leader. Can we do that more? And are we doing that enough?
I think we're seeing even some cultural shifts a little bit in terms of body image. I think there's a little bit out there. There's a whole lot of fighting back. There's an industry out there that makes billions of dollars on women's bodies and how to change them. And you see them regularly if you watch commercials anymore, which most people don't because of DVRs. But so that's definitely out there. I think it's about personal relationships. I think it's about moms who are able to go to that place. I think it's about women who are able to tell that story. That was one thing that happened in my classroom this year is I felt like we were able to talk about that a little bit.
So not just moms either. I mean, as a mom, but also as a woman teacher.
Yes.
And I wrote an essay recently about, I go to my YMCA and I was an athlete, so Title IX meant something. I didn't know anything about Title IX until well after I was playing sports. But what seems remarkable to me is that all of us women were needing Title IX, and it was an education initiative. It wasn't a sports initiative. But as our culture goes, the sports became sort of the. But I don't see women out there playing with the girls, and therefore I don't see girls out there playing. I do see men out there playing. So, and I think what you're saying is in real life, as a teacher or as a mom or as a neighborhood Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. I think women thrive best when we are good to other women. You know, I mean, Margaret Mead said there's a special place in hell for women who are horrible to women. I'm completely paraphrasing, but it works.
It's a good point.
It's a good point. It works the opposite as well, and it's powerful. And it can't just be moms. It's got to be teachers. It's got to be faith communities. It has to be tapped into that how you are is absolutely fine. The other piece of it, though, and you mentioned it, is the boys, because we can't say bad boys, bad boys. Boys are as manipulated into the expectations that they have as young women.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad you said that.
Yeah.
That's really important. What's in it for you? Why all this? Why be so involved in community in so many ways? And really as a leader, but you're not the leader that, I mean, yes, you ran for office, but you're not the leader that's always standing up and saying, look, you are not saying stand. You're doing the work. That's your leadership gift. Why? What's it in for you?
Oh my gosh, what's not in it for me? You invest in the community, you invest in kids, which is a very powerful, important value for me and my family and those that I know very well. And it's only going to make things better. It's only going to bring people together. And this project that I have worked with in Lakeville, that's their goal. You have businessmen and you have teachers and the superintendent.
That wouldn't normally.
No, they come together and they all have great stuff to bring to the table. And they want to make things better in their community. Communities thrive when they have educated, healthy, unified in whatever ways possible. We like differences. You know, democracy thrives on conflict and compromise. But when you're able to bring those pieces together, you know, when we all do okay, we all do okay, right?
And
or do well. That's what Paul Watson would tell you. But yeah, I mean, it's the idea of being able to invest and be part of a bigger community.
And just a teacher can do that.
Yeah.
And I would never say just a
No, but you're right.
But
ask.
Right?
Ask and you will be given. I think that's basically what it is. So.
I'm so glad that you accepted our invitation to come talk.
Thank you for asking. It's been great. It's been great.
Sigrid Iversen, an amazing community and engagement leader, a citizen professional, a mom, a teacher. It goes on and on. She's a perfect example of how just anything, anyone can make a huge difference in community.